Welcome, business podcasters, to another episode of Podcasting and Professional Services. I'm your host, John Tyreman, and today we have a special episode. I'm going to go over some research that I've done from some secondary sources, as well as for the past year or so, I've been compiling data on different podcasts that serve the professional services space. So podcasts that focus on the accounting industry, podcasts that focus on the AEC industry, the consulting industry, the legal industry, government contracting, and technology. Those are the different industry segments that I've identified and have started to build out a database of podcasts, of shows. There's almost 300 shows that I've identified that are in this sample that I'm going to go over today. So this is going to be really, really interesting. If you're listening to this, I'll describe the data for folks that are listening to this on Apple or Spotify, but you can also follow along with visuals on my YouTube channel. So go to YouTube, search for Podcasting in Professional Services, search for me, John Tyreman, and you should find my YouTube channel. Go ahead and subscribe to that too, so you can get notified of new videos and new episodes. This episode today is actually going to kick off season 2 of the show. My goal is to continue interviewing successful business show hosts in those industries that I mentioned earlier. And also, I want to bring you more voices from the podcasting space. So folks that run podcasts about podcasting, again, kind of like what I do, but they serve the industry in different ways. So they might be focused on a different niche like sports or entertainment, but their focus is podcasting, and they've got experience managing many, many different shows across their portfolio. I just think it's good to look at podcasting, not just from the folks that are in business and doing business podcasting, but there are things that we can learn from looking across industries and across genres too. So having folks that focus on podcasting in different niches, I think that there is some value that we can extract from those folks and apply it through a business lens. All right. So podcasts are still relatively new in their adoption by businesses. If we look at the total number of blogs on the internet, there's 600 million blogs. By comparison, there are only 3.6 million podcasts. And this is across all genres. So there's almost 250 times more blogs on the internet than there are podcasts. So just as a point of comparison, if we look at podcast listenership in the United States, in 2025, half of Americans will listen to podcasts at least monthly. And that figure will have doubled since 2018, when about 25% of the US population aged 12 or older listens to podcasts at least monthly. So 25% in 2018, 50% in 2025. So that's doubled in that time span. And the chart that I'm looking at, it went back all the way to 2008. And then in 2008, 2009, that figure was at about 10%. So in the last 15-ish years, the percentage of Americans that are listening to podcast audio at least monthly has gone up 5 times. It is growing. I don't think anyone can refute the impact of podcasting, especially on this last presidential election. Played a huge role in terms of both candidates. So those are a couple of different big broad trends. And if we look at business podcasts specifically, business podcasts represent the 4th biggest genre of podcasts. So number 1 is society and culture. Number 2 is education. Number 3 is arts. And then number 4 is business. And that represents just under 9% of the total shows if we break out that 3.6 million by genre. And if you're on YouTube, you can see this pie chart with all of the different genres, all the way from religion to comedy, health and fitness, news, leisure, music, sports, TV and film, technology, all the way down, represent smaller slices of the pie than business. Now, across all podcasts, about 17% of all the podcasts available, of these 3.6 million, about 17% are active. And so they have published an episode within the last 90 days. If we apply that percentage to business shows, active business shows make up only 1.5% of all podcasts. There's a lot of blue water out there, especially for professional services firms. Because the reason why, especially professional services firms, is because you're in the business of expertise, right? You're in the business of building trust with buyers at scale. Because, we're not talking about selling $100 services here. We're talking about selling high ticket professional services, business to business. There's a lot of trust that needs to be built up throughout the sales process before a decision is made. And that trust can be built at scale through a podcast. Folks that are listening to you for years build a relationship with you. They come to understand your personality, your point of view, how you view the world. Also, just the mere exposure effect of your face on a screen as they're scrolling social media builds familiarity, and familiarity is a stepping stone to trust. So, there's a lot of blue water for podcasting right now, especially in professional services industries where it is an expertise based sale. It is all about that human connection, those relationships. And podcasting is just such a natural fit into marketing a professional services firm. So let's take a look at the sample that I looked at. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of podcasts, specifically in professional services industries. I started building out this list of shows in professional services about a year ago. And I've got a list of almost 300 shows, and they span across accounting and finance, architecture, engineering, construction, consulting, government contracting, legal, and technology. If you're on YouTube, you can see this pie chart breakdown of those different industries and how that represents in the sample. Accounting and finance makes up about a quarter. AEC represents about 30%, consulting 22%. And then the remaining 20% is split up between GovCon, legal, and technology. So that's the industry focus of the sample that I took a look at. And I intentionally oversampled active shows. And I wanted to understand, of the shows that are active today, what are the different characteristics of that? I did include about 25% of the sample is inactive, and I wanted to include a sample of inactive shows to really dig deep into, why did they stop producing episodes? How many episodes did they go before they shut off the lights, so to speak? And that kind of post-mortem analysis helps us understand, what runway do businesses give to podcasts? It doesn't give us any definitive answers, but it helps us paint a picture of, how much risk is a business willing to tolerate in investing in a podcast before it turns out the lights. Let's get into some of those characteristics. One of the big takeaways that I saw from this research was the opportunity for co-hosted commentary style shows. Now, I'll give you an example. One of my clients, his name is Ken. He offers financial services, M&A advisory services, consulting services to chauffeur transportation companies. Super niche. And he was just getting so tired of flying around the country to go to all these different speaking engagements. He does awesome research. He's got a ton of research specifically on that industry. And he's just tired of doing that. And they're all pay to play engagements. So he wanted to launch a podcast so that he could leverage a digital medium to demonstrate his expertise. And we launched a show with a co-host. Ken co-hosts the Ground Transportation podcast with James. And now James offers complementary services to the exact same target audience, chauffeur transportation businesses. And so they're non-competitive, they're complementary services, and they co-host this podcast together in which they have co-hosted commentary style episodes where Ken and James are going back and forth talking about a specific topic. They also have interview episodes where they bring on owners and operators of chauffeur transportation businesses talking about their experience building their business to where it got today. Ken will go off and do one-on-one interviews. James will go off and do one-on-one interviews. Ken and James will have group conversations with a guest. So there's a number of different combinations. And what this does is it provides not only variety to the listeners, but it also kind of reduces the burden on the hosts, right? So Ken is able to go off and do a one-on-one interview. James doesn't need to be there. Same thing if James wanted to do a one-on-one interview and Ken didn't need to be there. If they didn't have a guest, they could get together and record content. It gives them a lot of flexibility in their production. It also injects their own thought leadership into the show. So Ken and James are able to talk about topics that are relevant to the services that they provide, as opposed to always constantly putting the spotlight on the guest and featuring them as an expert and their experience. So it balances out thought leadership with the growth potential of having guests on the show and leveraging their network when they share the episodes with their audience. So there's a big opportunity for co-hosted podcasts. In the sample that I took a look at, 63% have just one host. And there are some monologue shows in that 63%, but the majority of the shows that are hosted by one person are interview-based shows. And as I mentioned earlier, talking about the ground transportation podcast and how Ken and James are able to inject their own thought leadership and their own subject matter expertise, it's really, really hard to do if you run an interview-based show. So that's one big opportunity that I noticed. About a third of the podcasts have multiple hosts. So there's definitely potential for more there, especially if you run a niche show. All right, so another big finding, and this was when I separated out the inactive shows versus the active shows, and I looked at, okay, what is the total number of episodes published for inactive versus active? And I grouped those episode numbers into different bands. So I grouped them into, do they have 1 to 24 episodes? Do they have 25 to 49 episodes, 50 to 99, 100 to 299, or greater than 300? And what I found was that more than half of the inactive shows failed to reach 50 episodes. And then if we layer on that other 23% in that 50 to 99 range, then we're looking at almost 80% of the inactive shows failed to reach 100 episodes. So there's something that happens between that 50 and 100 episode mark. That's the range in which most podcasts, when and if they go inactive, that's the range in which they do it. So if you're a business podcast, one of your initial goals is to hit that 50 episode mark. Whether that happen, whether it's a weekly show and you're doing it for a year and you take Christmas and Thanksgiving off, or it's a twice monthly show and you do it for 2 years, that 50 episode mark is a good waypoint, checkpoint to check back in and say, okay, is this worth the investment? So that's one of the big takeaways that I have there. If we look at the active shows in this sample, a combined 60% have over 100 episodes. So a lot of these shows have been on the airways for a long time, or they've been publishing episodes frequently for the last few years. Of the podcasters that I've interviewed on this show, many of them started in 2020 during that pandemic when there was that big boom of podcasts. And they've just simply lasted this long. And they've found great success in doing that. And there are some shows that have a slower publishing cadence, and they started in 2016 and they've only recently hit that 100 episode mark. And so their experience is a lot different. And that's one of the big levers that you have, is how frequently do you publish episodes? So that begs the question, how frequently are these shows in the professional services? How frequently are they publishing episodes? And so I took a look at all of these different shows, all 287. And if we filter out just the active shows, then 54% publish weekly or more frequently. So that is the most common frequency of these shows in publishing their episodes, 54, almost 55% weekly or more frequently. A 24% publish twice monthly. And so that's a great cadence if you're just starting out and you need to figure out your operation. Going back to that example that I shared earlier with the ground transportation podcast, we did start with a twice monthly cadence, and then we increased that to weekly when we decided that this is working, we've got a good operation, let's hit the gas pedal. So you don't need to pigeonhole yourself into just being a weekly podcast right out of the gate or just being a twice monthly podcast. You can absolutely change your frequency as you go, as you iron out your operations to accelerate your path to podcasting success. Some industries were more likely to publish more frequently than others. So when I break down the data by industry, accounting and financial services, podcasts that serve that space, and podcasts that serve the legal space were less likely to have a weekly publishing cadence compared to shows that focus on the consulting industry or shows that focus on technology. So it's an interesting finding in that the frequency that you publish your show, you might want to take a look at other shows in your industry just to help in your positioning. So if you are in accounting and financial services and you want to publish a show, one way to differentiate your show would be to have a weekly show, because the shows in that market are less likely to publish weekly. So you could stand out and gain more ground by having a more quick publishing cadence compared to other shows in your niche. So that's just one way to approach the strategy of your podcast. And then I also wanted to include, and this is not proprietary research done by me, this is actually data that was provided by Buzzsprout to a company called Podmatch. And they put out a report, and I'll link the report in the show notes here. They look at the top podcasts and they break it down by episode downloads in the first 7 days. So the top 1% of all podcasts across all genres get nearly 5,000 downloads in that first 7 days. So many shows, especially in podcasting and professional services, are not going to see that level of success simply because we have a much more narrow target market than the Joe Rogan experience. So if we take a step down and let's look at a top 5% podcast across all genres. A top 5% podcast gets 1,100 episode downloads within the first 7 days. So you publish a new episode, you can expect within 7 days that episode will get over 1,000 downloads. There's not many shows in professional services that are even a top 5% podcast. So let's take it a level down. A top 10% show, when they publish an episode, that episode you could expect to get 462 downloads in the first 7 days. A top 25% podcast, a newly published episode would get 109 downloads in the first 7 days. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. A top 50% podcast across all genres, publish an episode and you can expect 28 downloads in the first 7 days. Now, that is a reasonable benchmark to hit within the first year of your podcast. Can you get to a point where each time you publish an episode, you're getting at least 30 downloads within that first 7 days? And if you can do that and sustain that over 5-10 episodes, then you can confidently say that your show is in the top 50% of all podcasts on the internet. And I think it helps put things in perspective, right? It helps put your show in perspective and, what does good look like and what are the leading indicators of success? Of course you want your podcast to generate leads. Of course you want your podcast to generate revenue. Of course you're going to want a sponsorship to offset production costs, but those things don't happen overnight. And what are the mile markers to look at along the way? The goal should be at the onset, it could be, hey, let's publish 50 episodes. And if we can get it to 28 downloads in the first 7 days for each episode, then we're on the right track. And I think that's the right mindset to look at podcasting and professional services, especially because it's such a long-term investment, right? I was talking with Two Bobs, with David C. Baker and Blair Enns of Two Bobs, and they told me that they do have folks reaching out to them, leads that listen to their podcast, but they say that, oh, I've been listening to your show for years and I just haven't had an opportunity to reach out to you. But now that I do, you're the first person I think about. And so if we unpack that a little bit, if your goal is to generate leads from your podcast, it's a long-term investment and it's a content vehicle to share your expertise. Now, there are other ways of generating leads through a podcast, interviewing your ideal client profile. I'm working with a couple clients on interviewing referral sources to build relationships with referral sources and making deposits into those relationships to increase the chance of referrals. That's another approach that you could take. There's a number of different ways that you could approach lead generation with a podcast. In conclusion, what I would love to do is to create an annual report of the state of podcasting and professional services. This was very much an exercise of just, I happen to be accumulating this data anyways, and I wanted to package it up and share it with you. But I realized that there is an opportunity for me to collect even more information from shows and professional services, these interviews that I do. I would love to create a survey and to hear your experience. And if you'd like to, share your experience or be featured on the show, if you're a business podcaster, reach out to me on LinkedIn, reach out to me on my website, redcedarmarketing.com, and let's chat. So thank you so much for everybody for tuning in. I know this was a little bit shorter of an episode compared to some of the interviews that I do. But if you made it this far, please subscribe to the show on Apple, subscribe to the show on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and would love to hear what you think. Leave a rating and review. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Send me a note. Happy podcasting.